Welcome to Psychologist Talks. This is going to be the second episode in a series about depressive personality disorder, and this episode is all about subtypes. But much like I mentioned in episode 1, because of the pushing out of depressive personality as a dominant personality disorder, research has gone down substantially. This is already on the heels of the field not really, in my opinion, treating personality disorders with much respect, and thereby they don't get a lot of attention, and thereby not a lot of research. And so this episode is kind of spread into the wind. I'll try to narrow focus on a few things. One is going to be a psychodynamic diagnostic manual. They often talk about the introjective versus the anaclitic. This is sort of the inward focus versus outward focus polarities. And that can create a subtype, if you will, of which way does somebody lean. Personally, I believe most people tend to lean with both. It's just about how much. It's not like one or the other, but I think they say technically it could be one or the other. That's just my 2 cents. I'm going to kind of hybridize. Theodore Millon is a big personality guy. Rest in peace, Theodore. I mostly know him initially through his assessment instrument, the MCMI. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to mention him, but I'm also going to add Anecdote to that too, because it just kind of gets messy. You'll hear probably when we get to that section, me just kind of like blending a lot because I'm trying to, what I'm essentially saying more than likely is, look, the depressive personalities, there's a low bar for meeting depressive personalities because it's just a widespread issue. I said this in episode 1, depression is widespread. When it's chronic, it's relatively easy to start eking into what I would argue is to be an aspect of personality. Remember, genetics and environment is personality. And with that, it tends to have lots of perceivable subtypes because there's lots of other personality flavors that crop up. And I see this in my psychological testing frequently. And then I'll make mention of masochism, or self-defeating personality. And then a final mention of what's called a hypomanic defense is the polar opposite, basically, of a depressive personality. Let's see if I can fit that in. So let's start with the introjective versus the anaclitic. Remember, that's how inward focus versus outward focus somebody is. It's the simple way of thinking of it. The introjectives are the ones that are looking in. They tend to be wildly self-critical of themselves. Not that the anaclitic are not, but they tend to be just kind of always looking inward. I am somehow fatally flawed. I will somehow screw this up. They say something here that's really good in here. They work hard to be good, quote unquote, but rarely succeed to their satisfaction. Endlessly self-critical. It's a beautiful quote. Tragic quote too. It's just, I'm never going to measure up. I'm never going to measure up. That is different than the analytic that is extremely preoccupied with relationships in their life. And so there's a little bit of like, things are wonderful when I feel attached and cared for and nurtured, but there's always the fear and the sabotaging fear that they will lose their relationships because they are so worthless and inept and something is just going to be lost. The other shoe will drop. So simply put, one is the other shoe will drop, and that's because of my own failures. And those people tend to they tend to neglect their relationships a lot because they're so inward focused. And the other one, the other shoe is going to drop, and so they're desperately, anxiously, insecurely grappling with their relationships. I'll note on the first one, the sort of introjective, this is different than like an injured narcissist. These people are truly, truly not a facade. They truly do feel and act as though they are depleted. But people, much like I mentioned in the dependent personality disorder, I think lay people who don't understand better will sometimes label them as injured narcissists because of the me focus. It's not a me focus because I devalue and I don't care and I'm secretly thinking I'm better than you. It's a me focus because they're preoccupied so much with their own badness. It becomes about them. It ironically becomes all about them, which leads them to the very rejection that they fear so much, because they're just like, I can't even be around you because no matter what I say, you're always assuming it's going to go wrong. I can't even build your esteem up. You're not even listening to my feedback. Why am I going to even spend more time and effort on this relationship? You darn, injured, covert narcissist. No. These are two very different things. The depleted sense of self is real. There's no facade. It is right there on the surface. And it just spreads like a bog that cannot be stopped. It is in the never-ending story, the nothingness that consumes all, and people want to run from it. The Anaclitic sounds a lot more like a dependent framework, or even like a borderline personality disorder, or let's just talk about attachment theory, right? An insecurely attached individual, and they cause a lot of noise through their fear of someone's going to leave me, and will be lost in the process, which looks a little bit different. It's kind of like I don't know why this image is. We got the bog on one side, the other one's just like spraying black paint on everything. Like, everything's gonna be bad, everything's gonna be lost. They're to me, they have more energy than the sort of the depleted, hidden, just kind of like sinking into the quicksand version. Atreyu, if I go back to Never-Ending Story. Oh my gosh. Well, Depressive Personality fits perfectly. Go to Never-Ending Story. So anyway, that's the kind of polls on that the psychodynamic folks offer. On the flip side of things, let me check something here real quick. Yeah, on the flip side of things, there's the Millon theory. And you have to understand, like, the MCMI, lots of personality dynamics can spike at the same time. There's statistical reasons why we have to be careful about that stuff within this particular instrument. But anecdotally, and a little bit of what Millon has talked about in the past, is like you will see these kind of quasi-subtypes show up by virtue of what also co-elevates with the depressive personality. And anecdotally, I absolutely see this. The two most common, anecdotally, in my experience, is avoidance and dependence. These three, if you're not audio only, I'm failing at hand gestures. These three tend to, I think they kind of co-correlate, because as much as there's the introjective type that the PDM folks, the psychodynamic folks talk about, I find it very hard for there to be no other focus whatsoever. It's, to me, incredibly rare, because depression, the depletion of self, exists in contrast to the other. Like, it's always a unit of comparison. Just one is more like out there anxiously about relationships, and the other one is just so staring into the void, they just don't orient as much. They have like an internal orientation to others, not really a practice of orienting, but it's all about the other. And so by virtue, you get these elevations in avoidance and dependency because, well, let's think about it. All three of them share this kind of deficient sense of self. But the results for depressive side of things is wallowing in pessimism and self-criticism. Dependency is a fear that they're going to be alone and they're so incapable they need a powerful other to help them out. And so they tend to just kind of inhabit a frail position, both as a means of, well, I shouldn't say both, as a means of gaining that support and or, it's the only way they know to operate, because they're just so depleted internally and they need somebody to help them. So they grab on to someone like their life depends on it, like an infant grabbing onto something and your hair, and it won't let go. The avoidance side is like, well, I'm so inept and so incapable, I'm going to fail anyway. And I have a huge history behind me of like social failures on top of that. So I'm not going to go out unless I'm sure of being liked. And, and even if I do, again, I'm going to fail. So what's the point? I don't belong here. And so those tend to crop up. You'll get more of the avoidant, socially, anxiously preoccupied and doesn't want, is very inhibited. I think you'll get kind of the insecurely attached, just kind of constantly causing noise in their relationships, but it's dominated by a depressive mindset. You will have the ones that are very clingy and dependent in nature. And, I think there's possibilities for other types. We'll talk about masochism here in a second. But anecdotally, again, that's a lot of what I see. And this is where we start heading into masochism. So again, we've done the introjective and anaclitic. We've got these like quasi-subtypes maybe floating around through Theodore Millon's theory. To me, again, it falls generally well enough on the introjective versus anaclitic. And now we go to number 3, which is differentiating it from masochism or a self-defeating personality. Now, let me be clear. I'm going to have my own episode at some point. I work full time, got a new kid, all sorts of stuff. So when I shoot these, it's its own sort of dilemma. At some point, maybe, hopefully, we'll have an episode or two on masochism and self-defeating because they're technically different. But once again, I find them to be frequently related. Masochism and self-defeating personalities are really interesting because there are these more sort of internally inept, I am bound to suffer. Yeah, this is the really big piece of it. Suffering is part of my existence. It is inevitable, and they will, in a self-defeating, masochistic way, often find themselves, not necessarily consciously, frequently unconsciously, in situations that verify that concern. I mean, they throw themselves into suffering. They choose negative relationships. They sabotage things that could be potentially productive for them. And in doing so, it's like, I described the introjective so preoccupied with the void that they ignore everything else. The masochist will walk into the void and pull things into it. I mean, they will tell you to your face that they want to get better, but they are just like part of the void, the Borg. Assimilate everything through a depressive lens. Now, again, this is why it's its own beast. I mean, it really is something very different because they're not just wallowing, they are self-sabotaging in the process. But what's really interesting about masochism, when you talk about the other, you can also get these flares of negativism, these flares of resentment. That essentially, if people treated me with greater respect, if I had not been dealt such a raw deal in life, I would be in a better spot. You get this kind of flare of narcissistic entitlement, but it's not strictly narcissism. There's even some possible sadism floating around in here, where that entitlement then leads to increasing othering of other people, sort of projection out of this internal shame and badness of how the world is bad and the world sucks. And this is where you get that kind of incel-y vibe from some people who have a long history of depression and begin to reject, instead of rejecting themselves, they reject the world, they reject other people, and they develop a strong defense system around that. But again, that's not quite masochism. That also goes in a way towards, further evolutions, which I'll have to figure out how to unpack in another episode. So that's not a subtype of depressive personality disorder, but think of it as like a branch off that you need to be mindful of, because it creates its own course and thereby creates its own version of treatment. But they will present frequently, in my opinion, with a depressive vibe first and foremost. You will not detect the masochism right away. You will detect the depression, unless they're heavily externalizing, and they usually don't come in for treatment if they're at that juncture. But in my experience, you will get the depressive vibe first, and then you will start to notice the masochism, the self-defeatism over time. That's why I'm presenting it here. So, all right, that's number 3. Number 4, okay, is the hypomanic defense. This is the polar opposite. Let me just be 100% clear. You're not going to think this person is depressed. Because it is what it sounds like if you're familiar with this idea or notion of mania or hypomania, the hypomanic defense. The idea there is mania is so stark. If you go to my bipolar episode, there's no confusion there. Hypomania is this like subtleness to it. And the hypomanic defense is this idea of someone who is constantly thrill-seeking and sensation-seeking as a means of avoiding underlying depressive ideologies and belief systems. They're incredibly hard to slow down. They are usually not coming in for treatment unless a loved one, if they're in a relationship long enough to even be encouraged to go into treatment, because they're just denying and suppressing. It's a defense at all costs. If I slow down, depression is there waiting for me. So they tend to be very lively and engaging, and your first reaction as a provider, or even as, a potential friend or partner, is like, wow, this person's so fun, right? Like, this is great. They're active. They pull me places. I'm introverted. I don't like going out as much. Or, oh my gosh, they're even like more socially inclined than I am. High five, my partner in crime. But very quickly, you will notice intimacy suffers because they cannot slow down. Because if they slow down, depression and depletion awaits them. And so they keep the world and they keep their internal world at arm's length. It's a very lonely, very sad state of existence. But they do have to slow down, and once they slow down, if you can navigate around this defense, depending on how strong it is, depression awaits you. On the bright side, as much as I said it's sad, it's better than like an injured narcissist, in my opinion. Not to like scorekeep here. Like, at least they're not devaluing the world. They're not like attacking others and being like, people are less than me. Instead, they just suppress and repress, and they replace with excitement, the opposite feeling they replace it with. So, that's not really a subtype. It's not really, a differential. It's just something to be aware of, because it's, I think I've run into it once or twice, maybe. I don't know. But, it's something to kind of keep in mind that a super hidden version of depressive personality disorder can be the hypomanic defense. So, tossing that out there. So that's my disorganized episode on subtypes. That's about the best I can do. I think at the end of the day, this harks back to what I said in episode 1 is, what's the difference between PDD or dysthymia and depressive personality disorder? There isn't one, because depressive personalities vary so much. I didn't even talk about, there's probably somaticizing types, right? Like, instead of a hypomanic defense, there's like high levels of somatization. There could be gender socialization components to that. There could be, the kind of dissociative defenses associated with that. I think there's just so many potentials for subtypes, because the umbrella for depressive personality is so large. And that's probably also why it was eliminated. Like, maybe it should be eliminated. Maybe this idea is like depression is a modifier for other personality types, because it's just so universal. It's such a common facet of the human condition. Maybe that's why there doesn't deserve to be a depressive personality disorder in our diagnostic manuals. I'm not wed to that. I think there's something very telling about depressive personalities, and as a disclosure, as I've disclosed across other episodes, I consider myself on the depressive spectrum, and it to me, I don't know, it felt like home. It felt like it described me better than a dysthymia or a PDD in these clinical terms, or other personality issues. Like, I really didn't have a place for me until I found depressive personality, because there's a lot of potential in there. Again, through subtypes like we talked about today, but it also encompasses my experience. So sure, one could technically argue maybe it doesn't have a place, and maybe it's, a modifier. But to me, it captures me, and I think it's captured a lot of people. You just have to be ready, because it's a bigger tank, right? Like, a lot more can fall into it than other personality disorders, which are a little bit more narrow and specific. So hence a more broad and unspecific episode on subtypes. So anyway, I'll end there. As always, thanks for listening and watching. I think we're, maybe I'll do development, gender. I never know what's, relevant enough, but I'm sure there'll be at least one other episode here, so stay tuned. But yeah, as always, stay curious.